He does outdo himself, you'll admit it. Yeah. Thank you. I'd never thought about the Plantagenets with the movie, but that's one way of looking at it. And of course, it was an interesting, very interesting life, I would say, as we're going to see as we get into the Plantagenets and as we go all the way to 1399 and the rest of the 14th century, learning as we will about the Plantagenets. And remember, this goes all the way through April. So before we can get through his great grandson, who was not quite as bad as he was, but he would get close. And of course, you know, I mean, Richard II, in case you haven't checked the syllabus, in case you weren't able to. But welcome to all those who are here for the first time during this session, but not to single out individuals who blew me off last week or weren't able to be here, I would say. Yes, that's a better wording there. We have to start, though, with talking about the 14th century because, in general, it's quite a contrast with the 13th. They used to say that only an English major would love the 14th century, but that's really not fair. I think it has its great points when we think about the Italian Renaissance and so forth and so on. And of course, it's true, we all love Chaucer, even if we get it through one of those, what are those things called? Cliff notes, yes. You all have probably heard of those, but I hope you haven't had to touch them or be involved with them. But you all know people like that, yeah, who might use it and regret it now in their time of wisdom. Meanwhile, let's look at some of the things that weren't so pleasant in terms of the 14th century. And we'll get to others as we move on, because, of course, who doesn't associate the 14th century with the plague? However, when we talk about, and we all love movies, previews of coming attractions, we get to this when we consider all the joys of the 13th century, socially and economically, and then we get into the 14th and it's all downhill. And that's something that people often don't think about. We all have the signs, easy for me to say, but we had all the signs in the end of the 13th and the early parts of the 14th century. And that's to be borne in mind. The decline of population is already beginning then. And that, of course, has to do with the fact that the agriculture of the day simply could not support the population, as is still true in parts of the world today. And you know, of course, because many of us are involved in efforts to help these folks. So we understand, of course, that people, I don't know if they're not having children, but the children are not surviving at the rate they did in the 13th century. Because clearly from, say, the 10th century onward, the population kept expanding. And we just don't have, at that time, the resources to maintain the population, as is sadly so true for parts of the world today, which is almost unbelievable. In any event, this issue, despite a decline in the population growth, not necessarily population, will, of course, come to a screeching halt as a result of the plague. but this is merely a sign that they've gotten out of control. And of course, the economic problems will grow because despite all the land, they have limited ways of expanding cultivation because obviously they lack much of the knowledge we do today of growing. The wool trade and the significance of wool is not growing as it might have been desirable simply because the English themselves are taking over the woolen business, meaning they are not engaged in trade simply because they use all the wool themselves. That is simply to be noted as a factor because you can imagine the kinds of economic issues that will result. I mean, it benefits some and yet it hurts others. Periodic famines. And that might seem very odd when you think about the 14th century, but it's true. There are famines in the world today, clearly. And all you have to do really is pick up the, well, I was going to pick up the paper. How out of touch is that? But go to the websites and check on the places. The idea is industrialization and development will make that such a difference in terms of what's going on in what we call today the civilized world. And back then, we understand, of course, that the masses of people were living on the edge. Very much so, in terms of health, in terms of crop growth, and in terms of how is everybody going to survive. And of course, that means that if this is true, it will help with the survival of those who are fortunate enough to get to eat. But yeah, no, but the rest, of course, are casualties. And meanwhile, of course, land development involving the growth of more land, more lands of cultivation are going to be limited by the fact that during this period, the 14th century, the dreams of conquering Scotland, and you, of course, of Scottish ancestry will say, great, those English losers. But you'll understand, of course, that in terms of development of the British Isles will not work out nearly as well as we had hoped back in the time of Edward I and the expansion. I mean, think about Wales, because that's a tough nut to crack. I mean, Scotland's even harder. But by and large, what they have during the reign of Edward I comes to a screeching halt during this period. Now, of course, we know that 100 Years' War is coming. So that's very nice. But, and that will give some people jobs, at least temporarily, until they're killed. But, right? But we understand at the same time, the other conflicts are not going well. Don't forget, of course, the conflict with Scotland and, of course, the quote unquote development of Wales as an English province. All of this means that wars seem to be good sometimes for economies. And there was nothing except expense, I feel like, for the English, except for those who were getting, I guess, work out of this. And even then, you never know, you might be a casualty. So, Now we turn to the man of the hour. The man who is often rated, this is going to hurt if you, any Edward II fans, the most incompetent ruler in English history. Believe me, he has competition. It's not, there's no one who would compare as a monarch in terms of the level and competence. And of course, he lived a very tragic figure, and we'll talk more about that. Here, of course, we note that he becomes the first Prince of Wales. So this is something, if you're going to a party and you want to impress people with your knowledge of English history, you might drop this and think what people who don't suffer from Anglophilia like you do, face it, there's nothing to be ashamed of with that particular ailment. But those of us who are Anglophiles will know this, that he is the first Prince of Wales. I don't know what his father was thinking during this ceremony, like, gosh, that DNA didn't work out like I planned for. If Mendel had just been around at that time, he would say, yeah, could have done a lot better. We'll talk more about those early years, but you can see in this beautiful writing, Edward made Prince of Wales. So that's clear there. And of course, that is the ceremony. And for those who might have seen The Crown, you'll remember that now King Charles actually went to Wales to study and be around the Welsh and get that cultural opportunity and all of that. I'm not sure that this young Edward took such concern about it, considering the Welsh somewhat beneath his interest because he had lots of other projects. It was said, or I've said it, that he would have worked better in Walmart. Yeah. Or what is that store where you go to get hardware? What is Home Depot. Oh, thank you. Home Depot. You can tell how I get out a lot, don't you? Right? But at Home Depot, and you say, well, what does that say about Edward? It means he liked projects. Now, you know, I'm terrible. I just call people to come do it. I know that's wrong, because it's wonderful to do these projects and have a long list, and maybe, like, you know, you used to have the place where you could go and work on things and have groups. And, well, all of that is to say that's what he wanted to do. He had little interest in the Scottish campaign or any of that. It's sort of like, oh, Dad, do I have to? You know, that kind of thing. So if you are a great king and you have a Prince of Wales like this, who's always saying, got this project going on, maybe we'll have games, sort of play, that sort of thing, that's not really a source of joy. Okay. It's very, very difficult relationship. I mean, every family has issues. I get that. But this was very, very concerning for the king. Now, I have to mention the famous movie that many of us have seen and maybe enjoyed. But we understand that Braveheart is a movie. It is not history. So we understand that the image created of Edward, the future Edward II, I should say, was hardly that of a historical version. It was, I suspect, something dreamt up by Hollywood developers. So I'm okay with that, just so that you understand that anything you've seen in a movie is probably not accurate, but it's meant simply for the pleasure of moviegoers. Because to think of that as history, I won't preach about that anymore, but I just, so that we are clear that that image of the Prince of Wales is not clear. Was he a disappointment? Definitely, because he had little potential as king. And that, of course, is what it's all about. If you said, oh, I love building projects and working, maybe a team, had over some people and we're working, maybe get a degree in tech or something like that. And you say, wow, well, that's good. No, it's not. You need to be in Royal Leadership 101, that kind of thing. And you're not doing projects. It's very different. It's a different mindset. And we want someone who's going to be a leader. And clearly he was not. He had leadership challenges, as we're going to see throughout his early years. But the future Edward II was going to be under a lot more pressure than his father was. Remember, we'll never forget, will we? Simon de Montfort. Yeah, say it loud, say it proud. Yeah, because remember first term in case. Yeah, I mean, how important that was in terms of the history of Parliament. And now you say, how can we be sure that this young whippersnapper, that is to say, Edward II, is going to observe it? Well, this was the coronation oath. And this had probably been dreamt up by nobles and bishops, because this was not the same coronation oath taken by grandpa and father. Look at it, and if you will, the third line of the oath, or second, just laws and customs that the community of your realm shall determine. And you say, I wonder what they're getting at. Well, I don't think you have to have a law degree to figure that one out. They mean you better watch out. Oh, what was it my grandma? Mind your P's and Q's. You ever heard that one? Mind your P's and Q's. Basically means you better behave. You better straighten out. And I mean, this is all very polite. Of course, the British, we're not going to say, if you don't do what's right, you're going to get it. They're very polite, aren't they? So everything is according to ceremony, and the bishops are there, and the, anointing. You might have seen the coronation of Charles. Everything is very nice, and that queen. So yeah, it's all very polite, but there is a sort of threatening tone to this. Now, if he had been more like his father or his son, even, because remember, this is a dark spot in the middle of two graves. If you think about Edward I and Edward III, it's kind of difficult when you're a loser and you think, I mean, even my great grandson comes up as I do, and Richard II is nobody's dream of 5-star ratemyking.com. No, I mean, it's hardly, but he did not observe the just laws and customs, and he's going to get called on it too. I mean, you say, yeah, what are you going to do about it? Well, as we're going to see, they had plenty to do. All of this, of course, has not yet brought into the fact that after he became ruler, wedding bells would be ringing. It's a strange marriage in a way, and yet not strange at all. Her name was Isabella. She was the daughter of Philip IV. It was a carefully negotiated marriage, I should say. And that will not surprise you at all. She was a princess of France, and he was the heir to the English throne. And do I need to mention the joys of wine drinking? We remember Gascony. Yeah. Now you're going to be drinking that heavy Rhone wine over where you're going to be. And now that's not, I like that over in the Southwest, but all of this is to say that the English still have French interests. And even if they didn't, wouldn't it seem logical that that would be an important marriage? Edward I certainly thought so. Daddy. And I think Philip IV thought it was good too. And he had to come up with that dowry. Yeah. Because believe me, the English are going to expect it. So, yeah, lots of money's going to change hand. And then perhaps they were thinking that with the marriage, it would help Anglo-French relations. Whatever the case, they must have had lots of negotiations. I believe she was 12 years old. And he was about 15, 16, not ready to tie the knot. I mean, it's like the betrothal. Okay, it's a stage. We're not ready to, final commitment. Because I'm sure the father-in-law to be was saying, well, I want to see how this Philip works out. We'll be keeping an eye on things before we make the final arrangements for the trousseau and the various other aspects of the wedding. So they weren't married really until after Edward I's death. And Edward II had become king. But she is definitely a major figure in the story. No doubt about it. And interestingly, if you stop and think about it, she had a French relative who was already there. And you think, I wonder who that was. It was Edward I's wife. I know, if you're ever on a quiz show and they ask that, you could win the big bucks. Yeah. Margaret, Philip IV's sister. I know what you always wanted to know, but that's the truth. So you say, so her aunt was the Dowager Queen of England after Edward I's death. Yes. See, this is what Ollie does for you. All the useful information you get. Right, sure. But anyway, now she becomes Queen of France. And I wonder when her father, Philip IV, he's thinking there at the reception, that's expensive. Open bar, I guess. They're chugging all that wine down. He's thinking, I wonder if this was a good decision for my baby. I know how people are thinking about, was this really a good idea? Because of the relations between England and France. And remember, we always think about Bordeaux and the rest of Gascony in this mix. But we keep her in mind as the story goes on. As we keep this fellow, his name was Piers Gaveston. this 19th century portrayal is only that. In the language, I guess, of the 19th century, I guess we would call him a dandy. Have you ever heard that word used that way? A dandy. I always think, I don't think I've ever known any dandies because, yeah, no, most people, I think had to get jobs, do something. But this fella was a player. Could you say that of him? Okay. So I'll try to move up to the 21st and not say in the 19th century, but it's the sort of individual who's moving on up, trying to take advantage of situations. The idea being here that even when the king was still living, he discouraged the friendship between Edward and Piers. Piers was what we would call a Gascon knight. And not a knight, I think, so much in the feudal sense of being a warrior, but in the sense of being sort of upper middle class background in terms of today. In other words, not so much highfalutin, but he's not out working in the field. So that is to say that somehow he attracted the young prince's attention. I guess they were, approximately the same age. So they began to hang out, much to the disapproval of the king and probably the court. But you get the impression that Edward, the Prince of Wales, was doing what he pleased, regardless of his father's and his mother's, for that matter, disapproval. I think his mother was still alive at that point. You remember that she died early on, Eleanor, and then he remarried. But the relationship, I can't show it very well here, but if you're able on your own to see this portrayal, it shows the nobles and so forth looking horrified and disgusted at these two young men together. And how much of that is simply because of what the chronicles say. We assume that the king was very disappointed by his son, and it made the relationship even more difficult. So much so that apparently the king would actually banish Piers Gaveston, I think, to Ireland. And we may love to go to Ireland ourselves, but I think back in the day, that's not where Piers Gaveston wanted to be. And whether or not it was because of his friendship or just he wanted to be, as you say, where the action is, then it wasn't in Ireland, even though we love it very much now. So he got him back. Boy, you know how they would say, boy, she was barely cold in her grave before he started dating again. Yeah. Well, they do. I've heard that. I can promise you. And it's true. Piers Gaveston got on the next boat the minute Edward I was dead in 1307. And said, I am so glad you're back. So they were hanging out. And then, of course, he was marrying. Remember, from the very outset of the marriage, Isabella was going to have competition. because once Isabella becomes the queen, and the king has this special friend, Piers Gaveston, he's not going to say, well, you know, I better not stick around. I think I'll go back to Gascony. And no, he's going to be right there because there are plenty of opportunities for power, authority, and all the rest. And how much the new king, valued him is the fact that he got a title that was normally one given to a member of the royal family, the Earl of Cornwall. And when you get to be Earl of Cornwall, you're going to be strutting around and saying what I always love to hear from parents. Do you know who my father is? Yes, I love that. That meant so much. It was a sign of loving and sharing. Right. Could you imagine somebody coming in and saying, do you know I'm the Earl of Cornwall? You get down, as they used to say in the disco. Yeah. I mean, it really, really, to say that most people of authority thought Piers Gaveston was a loser, most hated individual in the realm, I would say, because you know how they say people who know how to use authority and feel everybody really respects them and all that. Well, that wasn't Piers Gaveston. He lets it all go to his head. And you know, Edward was quite happy to let him do it. Whatever kinds of magic that Gaveston was able to pour on to Edward, I guess we'll never know. Some have said it was same sex. Other people saying they were just very close friends, and that meant that because Gaveston wanted it, and Edward really wanted to work on his projects, he would have been there. They have these groups at Home Depot, and you can join. I've never done it myself.
Sure.
But yeah. I could go to a technology seminar, but I'm not going to. I'm just saying, I would rather call Spectrum and get them to do it. I know it. This is just a shame to admit it. True confessions. But understand that he wanted to work on projects and didn't really want to do the hard business of ruling. Because ruling is definitely more than just saying, you know, I am king. But he was really not up to it. And this, of course, brings up the question of Thomas of Lancaster. Now, I really want you to start thinking, because you will remember the Sicilian adventure, the Sicilian business. I'm sure it's stored away in that great treasure chest that we call your mind. And as you think about Sicily, and you'll say, oh, I remember all of that. I'll give you another hint. Henry III's younger son. See? That's why you're the great scholars you are. Yeah. You remember exactly that he was going to make Edmund, his son, the king of Sicily, but he ran short on money. Yeah. His name was Edmund. You see that Thomas of Lancaster up there? You know whose grandfather? Edmund. We are all family here, right? I mean, not necessarily a loving family, but a family. Because, so if you're doing trees right up here in your great mind, you will say, wow, this all ties together. You got Henry III, then you got Edward, then you got Edmund, and then finally you have Thomas. You say, Thomas of Lancaster, I wonder if he had any kind of power or control or he wanted it. You betcha. He's not named Thomas of Lancaster for nothing. Let me see where that map is. Well, I guess I didn't have it. Yeah, there it is. Am I not doing this right? I thought it was. What am I doing wrong?
Uh-oh.
Yeah. What am I doing wrong?
Let's see what we got here.
The what I want to show you is the areas that Thomas of Lancaster ruled over. Now he's the king's cousin, but at the same time,
Did you want to get to the map?
I want to go back.
I want to go back.
Yes. Oh. Okay.
There?
Here we are. Thank you.
Okay.
You see the gray area, and you say, that's a lot. Yes, it is. All of that area through marriage or through family, Thomas rules. Now, yes, he's just a royal vassal, but that's to say his lord is Edward II, and he has no respect for his lord, King Edward. It's like the king is a loser, right? I mean, it's like, and Thomas, just struts around, Mr. Big Stuff, the whole thing. So it is not a good relationship. Thomas, and those are his dates of life, becomes a great challenge. Now, how do you suppose Thomas felt about the king's chum? That is to say, Piers Gaveston. Very negative. Very negative. I'm not sure that Thomas so much wanted to be the king's pal as well as his cousin, as he simply wanted, what they all do, power and control. And he certainly didn't want someone like Piers Gaveston to be his opponent, because you might say they are rivals for control while the king is working on his projects. Now, he's also helping Isabella to make babies. They had 4 living children, and I know the king had one illegitimate child, which speaks to his ability to be a father. But that doesn't mean, of course, that he does not have time to run around with Piers Gaveston and pursue that relationship. Let's see. At this point, however, Edward's lack of authority becomes so serious that Thomas and his other cronies, and by cronies, I'm not talking about some sort of hoods, I'm talking about nobles and bishops, and they get together and they start, like you do, pull out their history books and read up on the reigns of King John, because who could forget him, and Henry III. And they start amongst themselves talking about, they've had some weak, incompetent rulers before. What did they do back in the day? Well, they would have, yeah, we want to help because obviously our king needs the help, a lot of help. So they issue what are called ordinances, and you'll have lords ordainer. And that means basically the king's government can do certain things, but only with our approval. And see, I don't know many rulers who like that sort of thing. Like to be told you better shape up. And you didn't submit that to us. Because the king is probably, shall we say, have favorites. And he doesn't want to have to put them through any kind of cross-examination process. And, saying, what do you mean incompetent? I don't like that. And so, as a result of all of this, we get the impression that the king was more than irritated by his cousin, Thomas. All of this would not have been as important if the king had really been other than what he was, which was basically a puppet of Piers Gaveston. I think Thomas knew it. I always wonder, would Thomas have actually liked to replace him as king? I think that would have been probably a step too far, but it was certainly something that Thomas must have contemplated, at least being the man behind the throne, the one who had the control. The problem is that I suspect Thomas either couldn't or wouldn't have the wherewithal, or is it back?
Go back.
Then Thomas basically decided, and this is like giving him a low grade in terms of leadership skills. Thomas could not stay focused between his own interests, and remember all that area he ruled, between his own interests. I think Thomas grew weary of controlling his group. And as a result, believe it or not, he sort of dropped down. I know that's very strange, isn't it? I mean, it's like he just couldn't stay with it. He just decided, I'll just stay home. And as a result, the middle party that pledged to try to get along with Edward, which is amazing. And it basically, we'll try to work with him, not against him, even though middle. So it's not the sycophant party, it's the middle party. We don't want to be as harsh as Thomas had been, but we still want to have an active role for the Lord's. Remember, community of the realm, say it loud, say it proud. We are doing what we should be doing. You say, well, could we call together some peasants to help us out? No. They're very busy. They're indisposed.
Yeah.
As we say in our society, right? So, yeah, that's definitely that they have no time. Yeah, they're on a tight schedule. So, by the early 1320s, a few years later, Thomas will try to take leadership. And of course, all of his territory is right near a border that many of us know and love. Yes, the border between Northern England and Scotland. And you know what? It's there. And you know what we like to do, fighting one-on-one. It's not like give peace a chance. All of this is just coming out. I can't control myself, these songs. Yeah. The idea being, though, Thomas is pretty much agitating towards taking over the throne of England, and then at the same time, seeing what he can do with Scotland, which is now ruled by a famous individual named Robert Bruce, with whom some of you will be familiar. This is in not that Robert Bruce, but this is a later one, relative. At the same time, by 1320-21, this Thomas is basically trying to lead the government. I guess he got energized and he wants to do something about the Gaveston situation. Basically, Gaveston had been eliminated early on by the party of Thomas. But the king did not stay alone for long, because about that time, the 1320, the individual that we see here, kind of a dandy outfit, you might say, this Hugh Despenser, he's called the younger as opposed to his father, and they were quite a pair. I'm using all these vulgar modern terms. Grifters, I would call them. I know. And you say, can these kind of people be grifters? I think so. Because Hugh Despenser, the elder, had been a courtier for Edward I. Now he brings his son in. They are influencers, I guess you would call them.
There you go.
So Piers Gaveston had been eliminated. And more or less, now we have the new royal favorite. I think they had moved in. It's sort of like, what is the old thing we learned? Nature abhors a vacuum. So this was a vacuum of influence. And I think father put son up to it. You know, they're members of the court. And we hate Thomas. No more Thanksgivings for you. You know, no family doing. Not that. But Hugh Despenser, the elder, and the younger are going to be, as we say today, very tight with the king. Now you say, well, how did Isabella? Did she want to hang out with them too? Not so much. Part of this, of course, is the queen wants her share of power. And at this stage, I think her duties vis-a-vis the children are probably completed. So she is ready now to exercise. I mean, she's the daughter of the former King of France and now the sister of the King of France. I don't think she's going to be relegated to a role of whatever you think, dear. I don't think we have any of that as far as these people are concerned. So Hugh Despenser is a problem all the way around. Up in the north, the king's forces are going to finally bring Thomas down. It's a place called Burr Bridge. I don't think it's like, oh yeah, I've been to Burr Bridge, hung out in Burr Bridge. I don't think it's like that. I think it's like many of our lovely places in the country, our rural places that we dearly love up in rural parts of Lee County or maybe Macon County, and we say they are very important to us. But ordinarily, many tourists miss these hot spots of civilization. So, in case you haven't been to Burr Bridge, you may want to put it on your schedule. You get t-shirts, mugs, and I'm sure we will all be very impressed. But at Burr Bridge, there is a major battle, and that battle is quite significant. And don't you know that it's way up there in the north, really close to the Scottish border? And don't you know those Scots were just loving every minute of it? Because this fellow, Thomas, is going to be brought down. You say, well, the king, wouldn't he be sad because his cousin got hurt? No. I think if you said it was a good thing, then it was good. All of this is why in the early days of 1322, Thomas is going to meet a very unpleasant end. And many of you know, and I don't think I need to prolong this, the drawing and quartering, it's just not good at all. But all of this is done with a crowd of locals. And you say, well, that's not nice. Borough Bridgians, I don't know what the Chamber of Commerce calls them out and said, because how would these regular people, I mean, could you imagine if you were Thomas, Mr. Big Stuff, and you're thinking, really? This is so undignified for these common people to come out here because, you know, they weren't polite. Yes, sir, we're going to miss you. You know, it's been real. No, I mean, they're throwing snowballs. I mean, yeah. So, I mean, the word rude comes to mind. A lack of good manners. Could you imagine what Emily Post would have said? Yeah, I mean, but he's a goner. And maybe he had it coming. I think this particular illustration, and it's only that, because I think it was far more grim than that. But I thought that was just interesting, the little robe he has on. I don't know whether it was, he probably had to make his peace with the Lord. I guess they gave him time. I think there was a member of the clergy there. Whether he had already been drawn, I don't know. I mean, I didn't do so well in biology, but I'm just thinking it would not be a good situation at all. But he didn't have to get hanged. That's the good part. His head was chopped off. You know, that was the difference if you were of a certain rank. Yeah, you get the chop. And that is, they say, hope I don't have to find out, very preferable to hang than hangings for the regular people. But all of this then is to say that that was the end, March of 1322. Now, cult time. Yes. Cult, say you. You thought there was a big one for Simon de Montfort. But when these big shots get executed, you know what they do, shed blood. And guess what? There's always somebody to say, blood, yummy. We love blood. Holy blood. We used to, on a scale of 1 to 10, is this some Saint Thomas who goes around healing people and say, reach out and touch? I'm not so sure about that. The legend of Saint Thomas is really, oh, I know, promoters. Yeah. I mean, it's like, yeah, you know, you have promoters out there. Like I'm talking like I know about the real world, but that, I think that's what they call these creatures. And they go out there, they don't work like we do, but they're just there sort of working up people. And I think that's what they did. God, when I found out about this cult of St. Thomas, I said, what did Barnum say about suckers? Yeah. But this became, did you get to read this? Strenuous champion of plentiful charity. Well, I think this is not exactly expressed in ways we would today, but who didst combat for the law of England's liberty, intercede for our sin. I mean, because I'm basically for righteousness and against tyranny. And then we think about Hugh Dispenser. Yeah, and that sort of thing. And you're thinking, who's doing this? Sometimes I think it has to do with monasteries collecting pieces. And then part of the cult, of course, is the ever popular fundraising. We always have to consider advancement. So it is interesting. And I think, you know, it's sort of like cults come and cults go, don't they? So I think this cult would be going. It was not as long lasting as the cult of Simon. But it's true, though. And you see these particular lines that they came up with to add to the various rituals. But remember, because all this is in Latin, and I'm not sure how much of the congregation would have been would have just, I guess they would have been praying, whatever. But that is the idea that he is the intercessor for the sins of the people. Thomas. And why? Because Edward II is not exactly on the list of great kings. So he's getting a 1 star. And as a result, you see what Thomas is, our hero, our intercessor. And we love him very much. That's where this cult goes. Now, when we get to this stage, 1322, now we get, if I may pursue my use of popular songs, we're in the money. This is an idea of total spoilage. You say, where is the king? What's he up to? Well, I think he's busy with crafts. Yeah. And that's fun. Building, not for me, but it is for others. And they're sort of shack. Radio Shack, yeah. That sort of thing. And you go and you get the parts and you work on these things. And so he's busy with that. And meanwhile, of course, what's going on with our best buddy? Well, he's busy being corrupt. Yeah, people do like to plunder when they can. Because remember, oh gosh, you just think about when Hugh Dispenser, the younger, was probably dreaming about getting all that land that belonged to Thomas or had belonged to him. He said, I'm doing this in the name of the people, you know, and all that. So that was a period of an unabandoned loot taking on the part of the king and Hugh. At the same time, there was a settlement with Scotland. That is 1323. And meanwhile, in case it couldn't be any worse, we will actually have a brief but unfortunate conflict with the French. And again, you sort of wonder, what is the king thinking about all this? But by this time, Hugh's authority is such that I'm not sure if it's sort of like whatever you think is best. It's amazing to think that I mean, this is a grown man, to think that he was in this stage, but I think that he really was. That is to say, Edward II. There was a brief war. It's a kind of war that could occur. Golly, I could think about the United States and North Korea. I mean, it's like border disputes, that kind of thing. You could be up there in the 38th parallel. You know, there have been problems there before. Or anywhere else where there are borders between hostile people. And obviously, the French and English have their problems. I mean, I know you say, but that's the French daughter, the royal daughter married to the English king. But you know, that doesn't cut any ice as far as the two royal governments go. So I think the French might have been a little pushy in that particular area. And of course, then they claim that the English in Gascony are not respecting French rights, trumped up, as they would say. So what happens? The French reoccupy. You say, well, this is a little annoying. Yes, it is. It's very annoying. And think about the next time you want to get a bottle of wine. Yeah, it's going to be pretty bad there in England because we love our wine, and the wine coming in from Bordeaux is not going to be available. So seriously, it is a problem because the English are more or less cut out of Gascony. Now, this won't last a long time, but enough that I guess Hugh told the king he had to do something about it. It's only so much you can do. Well, if we think back, and we always have to keep all of our little mental parts going, the queen is the sister of the now king of France. I love you, Charlie. Charles IV, known as Charles the Bell. Charles the Handsome. He was the third son after Philip IV. That's right. The third son. And he was now king. They had both died, his brothers. So now he was king. And what the queen could do about it, I'm not sure anyone really knew. But at this point, Queen Isabella, and we don't know exactly what that relationship, it hadn't gone wrong.
There we go.
What that relationship was going to be like. Shall we say, oh God, what was that magazine that my mother used to take? Ladies Home Companion.
Ladies Home Journal.
Yeah, that was it. And then there was a column in it called "Can This Marriage Be Saved?" And I always thought that was so exciting, coming from a small town. But all of this is to say, I guess if they had put the French and the English together, it was a troubling marriage.
Huh.
I think we've already been through Piers now.
I got you.
Yeah, now Hugh. So what's a queen to do? Well, if she had soured on her husband, and believe it or not, it was more, some say, it was more a matter of sharing the power and authority than it was about, does he really love you instead of me? I think that's a sort of, I don't know, maybe Hollywood take. Whatever the case, it was a chilly relationship between husband and wife. I'll put it that way. So, Isabella may or may not have appreciated the idea, hon, talk to your husband. Hon, I'm very close to Charlie. He loves me. I'd love to work out this problem we're having. And he looks and says, thank you, dear. That would be such a help. You're so special. I guess this is what people say back in the past. But you are wonderful. You French vixen, all of that. So she gets off to France, which is a very interesting. I mean, they went, took the ship to France for reunions and that kind of thing. But she's going more or less as a diplomat to her brother, saying, I represent my husband, the King of England, so let's work this out. It's different. She had a major delegation with her. I can vouch for that. Bishops and nobles and that sort of thing. You don't just go solo. You have this whole entourage. So this is going to be very, very significant. The role of dispenser, I'm not so sure. I believe he had the power, though. But they made a very bad move for them. Because once she was away, she could act with some impunity. Some, I say, because there were people there, watchers, if you want to call them, observers, who were probably reporting back, but luckily they didn't have texts and emails back then. So I'm sure it took a long time for people to get back to Hugh and say, boy, I don't know about this. Because she was very busy, I would call it involved in intrigue in Paris, such that she became involved with other exiles. And these other exiles would be very significant for her future. This, of course, is supposed to show, but of course, is only the illustration from a manuscript or probably a primary source, chronicle. So she's going to Charles IV's court to negotiate a settlement over Gascony. And she gets there and they talk, and somehow, and believe me, I use that word somehow because it's hard for me to believe sometimes. She persuaded her husband. And of course, Hugh controlled the husband, told him what to do. She persuaded her husband to send the heir to the throne. And this is Prince Edward. You know him as Edward III. Teenager. And why would he need to be there? Well, he could do the fealty and homage to his uncle. Because, of course, to say, Daddy's busy. Daddy's real busy ruling. So now you're going to be a big boy and go join mother, and you'll do this for Uncle Charlie. Okay? I mean, that apparently was that scheme. And the letters. Oh, you should read the letters that they would write, like, "You're so wonderful. I love you so much," and all that. Yes. And you say, "I think there's going to be treachery." You betcha. Because, yes, there's some evil. Because we're going to meet somebody special. Roger Mortimer. Roger Mortimer was actually English. You say, what's a nice fellow doing at the court of the French king? Well, he'd been involved in problems, shall we call them, in England. He was what they call a Welsh border ruler. They'd had a lot of land sort of on the English border near Wales. So he'd been involved in conflicts, and he'd spent a time in Tower of London, and perhaps that led to his having the opportunity to go to France, and better than being in the Tower. So, what happens? Well, at the risk of sounding like something from Lifetime or Oxygen, it seems that at one glass of wine, you say, "Oh, baby, don't fight it. It's bigger than both of us." Everything I shouldn't be saying, but all of this leads to, yes, adultery. And the queen, yes, you think, well, queens aren't supposed to do that. No, they're not. Kings do it plenty, but queens are not supposed to do it. Some people have said all of this is really about power. That really, instead of lust, whatever it is, they're using each other. I think that's probably more important than sex anyway. Whatever the case, the young prince did homage in his father's name. And then rumors came to King Charles that his sister was being, shall we say, naughty, and had forsaken her vow. So he ordered them expelled from the court. That hurts. Yeah. No turkey for you. No dressing. All of that was more or less going to bring about a decision of what I would now call co-conspirators, because those letters back and forth between Isabel and Edward are chilly. They're not nice. But she's got the boy now, because you know how that goes. All of this then is to say that because of this dispute, we call it that, these plotters, the Queen and Roger Mortimer, are already making plans when they are expelled by her brother. So what happens now is, in essence, a situation in which from Paris they will go north. And why are they going north? Because they are looking for fundraising. And why are we fundraising? Because when we go back to England, we intend to take over. And for that, you need to sell a lot of Krispy Kremes. And how are we going to do it? Well, we have a mighty nice looking little boy, teenager, and he needs to get married. So, where will that come from? It's going to come from northern France. Her name was Philippa, one of the very happy marriages. Edward III and I'm sorry, what'd you say? Oh, I mean, the paintings are just hokey, but I mean, it's just, it's not like the magic of Kodak. It's not a Kodak moment, nothing like that. But I'm sure this is 19th century, the way they would like to imagine. So, but she was Philippa Hanoff, which is up in Belgium now. And they had vital interest in this area of what is Belgium. So all of that meant that this was strategically very significant because they anticipated the French wouldn't like all of this activity and they were looking for allies. So as they got up there, must have been quite a diplomatic recession, the Queen and her boy toy. I don't know. I mean, can you imagine this is pretty lurid for a Queen. So all of that, we can think later about how we would cast this. Who would we have playing the role of the Queen? But all of this they would receive there at the court. And they started negotiating about the dowry and so forth. And I guess they came to some deal because this young woman joined more or less the entourage at this point, and she would become Queen of England for a very long time. Remember, the reign of Edward III would go on and on. 1377. So all of that is going to be very interesting because we never forget that dowry. You know, you're lovely. We're so glad to have you in the family, blah, blah, blah. But let's get this dowry going. So, first installment. And by this point, I don't think the Queen of England, Isabella, is sending any love notes or I heart you or any of that to Edward. Or certainly saying to Hugh, I know you have everything taken care of in my absence. I think it's pretty much, I think the English were beginning to realize about the possibility of invasion because I'm thinking Isabella had been doing some troop raising, that this thing was moving on. So here's a map, and you can see where it is. And you can see that area. See Flanders, Ghent, you see right over there next to Artois. So it's in a very, very useful area. And so she will maintain, Philippa, the future queen, she'll maintain a very important connection because she's not French. And that area will be strategically useful for the English in terms of trade and so forth. Meanwhile, off they go, headed for you know where, England. And I wonder how many troops they had. However many it may have been, they were effective. And I'm thinking that the royal force was not particularly loyal to the king. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because, you know, people like a winner. Uh-huh. And Hugh, you know who goes first. And who goes first is Hugh. And not in a pleasant way. No. Yes. let's just say that all the parts don't go with it. Okay. So we'll let it go at that. And then I guess he gets to watch the fire for a while before he gets to die. Yeah, not nice at all. But all of this, Isabella and Roger were enjoying, and I'm assuming there was an affair. I mean, Roger was married, he had a family. I mean, Lady Cleaver and all the little Cleavers were right there back home and waiting, where's daddy? And all of that. I know. Perfidious husband. Yeah. But that's Roger. So he and the Queen are really, if even if there was no more pillow talk, you say, baby, do you like power? You say, yeah, hon. That kind of thing. That can sometimes beat out the pillow talk, they say. So all of this then, Hugh's out of the way. Good, father's already gone. The king is at a place called Berkeley Castle. And this is how we get into the fact that starting on April 5th, just a few days, right at Stratford-on-Avon, a place many of us love, they're starting on with this play. I couldn't believe it. Not that I'm saying I want you to rush over there because you need to be with me. But I'm just saying that's going to be at the Royal Shakespeare. And I love Montgomery. Don't say I'm being ugly. I'm just saying it's very, very interesting that there was a whole play about this sordid business at beautiful Berkeley Castle. And try not to think about that when you go there, because they do receptions like they do here or Greystone, wedding receptions, because I looked it up. Yeah. So if you want to get married or have a party,
Birthday party.
yeah, you could do that at Berkeley Castle. So for a fee, I mean, it's not free. I don't want you to think that you're getting off for anything. And you say, gosh, what could be wrong at Berkeley Castle? Plenty. The king was held there, and the stories go that he was kept there in detention and kept there until he would sign a statement, basically abdicating. This site, this castle, it is said was a scene of horror while the king was tortured and abused until he would agree to the abdication, which of course he didn't want to do. When he did so, of course, he was no longer very valuable. So it is said that he was quickly buried with the consent of Isabella, and her son could now be crowned. The reason I put Gloucester Cathedral here is because the monks of Gloucester Cathedral, they had monks back then, they would all gather the parts that were supposedly Edward and say, oh, we'll take care of this. Because you know what they were thinking about? Relics. Yeah, because couldn't you think about, fundraising? Yeah. I'm sorry, yeah, advancement. Yeah, I've pushed that angle a lot. Yeah, but that's there in Gloucester Cathedral. If you're ever at Gloucester, that will be a perfect opportunity for you to see the tomb of Edward II, and you don't have to pay. Well, love offering would help, but yeah, and get me a shirt, a t-shirt, and a mug. So all of this then is what happened to him. Supposedly he died and was buried there. is all of this true? Well, we'll never know, will we? All we do know is that now Isabella and Roger have power. Oh, they have it in the name of the young king, because he will then be crowned King of England. Because they accept the Queen, well, I guess Queen Dowager now, and her son will be right there on the front row at the funeral. Oh, yeah. You know how people are. So, how much was little Edward involved? I'm not sure. I mean, he was old enough surely to understand what was going on. And for a few years, he would be involved. Yeah, this is actually that beautiful area. Many have actually said no one actually got to see the body, so they slipped in another body, and then Edward actually escaped. Yeah, as I say, this stuff keeps on coming. Oh, conspiracy theaters, take me back to November 22nd. I mean, take me to Dallas. Well, I'll go to Gloucester. I mean, there are always so many theories, right? So, whatever the case, supposedly Edward II is there, but somebody is there. And the Queen put on, ex-Queen, Queen Dowager, put on a great performance with her son of mourning. And I don't think Roger sat in the front row. No, that would have been a little obvious, right? So it's like, but they could mourn and say, we're so sorry. But there's the play. Christopher Marlowe. I wonder if that's appeared in those yellow and black things. Would you think so? The greatest hits of Christopher Marlowe. Because what do you call them? Those things you bought, those books. Yeah, but it's a great play. Yeah. But plays aren't history, right? We don't take our history of the Lancastrians from Shakespeare. I hope not, because they're meant for entertainment. But you want to fly over to Avon, and Delta is ready when you are, that you could do that. Heathrow or Gatwick. So the theory is that he actually made a getaway to a monastery in northern Italy where he lived out his life. I know. And he sent a note to his son saying, I love you very much and all that. But whatever the case, no one has ever been able to get permission to examine the remains, which is a very interesting effort. At this point, the days of the ex-queen and Roger are not long, because, as we all know, children do grow up, and sometimes they don't forget. I'm not sure the future Edward III would have counseling, but I'm thinking he's probably resentful of Uncle Roger for more than hanging out during breakfast and lunch. I'm thinking, Uncle Roger, don't you ever go home? It's that kind of thing. But all in all, eventually he reaches the age, the young king, that he will have Roger Mortimer executed, and he will have his mother retired. Yes, it's kind of a golden parachute, because she will be, it's sort of like going to Sunny Acres, and she'll have like a nice place, but there'll be people who will watch her. But she didn't have to do with that. I don't want you to worry. You did trips to Saks, Lord and Taylor. I'm thinking you would have opportunity, but you're gonna behave. And he comes out, they didn't have Mother's Day back then, but he comes out and visits his mother. Beautiful, isn't it? Thinking of May and how that's gonna be. So, but Uncle Roger is gone. He's what they call history because, and that won't be hidden because that means, of course, with Roger's death by execution, Edward, now in his late teens, that is to say, Edward III, will no longer have to worry about his mother and Roger Mortimer, and he will now become king. King for about 50 or so years, for a very long time, and we'll start there next time. Thank you all. Thank you.